Okay. Good morning. My name's Jonathan Bullen. I'm a Wajak Noongar man from the southwest of Western Australia. Thanks for having us here today. Before we start, I just want to give a quick intro, acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge that I am presenting from Wajak Noongar Buja country, and want to pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging.
Thanks, John. And my name's Ivan Lynn. Thanks for the invitation to talk here today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners where I am, which is Yamaji peoples. So I live and work on Yamaji country, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I want to thank you all for coming along today as well. Jonathan and I are talking about research yarning today. And I guess in the spirit of research yarning, we're going to have a bit of a yarn about research yarning, talk about a bit why it's important, talk about what it is, what yarning is, talk about what research yarning is, and then, and talk about some of our experiences about it. So yeah, thank you very much for coming along. So I've got a couple of slides. We might flick those ones up just quickly, but then we'll come back to this screen to have a bit of a yarn about things. Rightio, so I'll just do a quick bit of screen sharing. And we'll go. So I guess the first thing is to talk about why this focus on research yarning. And I'll probably, this is one article. And I want to pose the yarn to John actually, because research yarning is part of trying to do better and ethical research in Aboriginal healthcare. So, yeah, what do you reckon about that, John?
Yeah, I think it's well, there's a whole range of things, and we spoke really a couple of moments ago around my ability to go on huge tangents in yarns. So I'm trying to keep it, I guess, relatively concise, but there's so many things that come from this idea of why research yarning. And part of it's around, I think, good ethical research practice. Part of it's around, certainly around relational dynamics and power dynamics, which is underpinned by good ethical research practice as well. And part of it's around, I think, maybe quote unquote cultural norms, figuring out how best to have, I guess, a data collection process that ensures that you're not imposing your own needs as a researcher on communities who have given up their time to take part in your research.
One of the things we were talking about yesterday is that a lot of people say, I've heard it said a number of times when I've been working with Aboriginal colleagues and working with Aboriginal participants, who say we are the most research peoples there are, and research sort of has this sort of negative connotation, just that the term research tends to put people off. And I think that's in response to some of the historical practices around research, and I guess this distrust of research by some people within the Aboriginal community. Yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure. And you've done a lot of research with Aboriginal communities, obviously in the work you do, Ivan, as a physio and a researcher, in developing that evidence-based practice out there. And so you certainly, I guess maybe what I'm getting at is there's always a discomfort around how you might go and do this kind of thing and do it well. But a lot of it, like almost anything working in the space, is actually getting in there and becoming more comfortable with it, which usually happens through making a few mistakes and doing some things that aren't necessarily ideal, but it being you're still connected through a relational thing, which is where the yarn really comes in pretty handy, I think, because it's very human oriented. There's research, and I think that this goes back to that idea of ethics again, and disclosure, which we talked about the other day a little bit as well. But the idea of, we almost think that we've got to leave the human component out of a research practice, but actually, if we're going to bridge that gap of the trust and how to do good research, we have to bring that back into it, and we've got to understand how to navigate those tensions, which is where a lot of that discomfort, I guess, sits. I don't know how, when you started, and it was a while ago, admittedly, but when you started doing research in this space, how were you with that? How did that sit with you?
Yeah, I was. Yeah, I mean, I guess I first started when I did my PhD a number of years ago, and I had my original plan was, to do a pretty classic sort of, to collect data and administer questionnaires and all this sort of stuff. And I really, what became apparent was that what I was originally thinking, so my PhD was looking at chronic low back pain amongst Aboriginal people in regional and remote areas. And I was wanting to collect a whole heap of data and questionnaires about, various psychological domains around pain and this sort of stuff. And it came quickly obvious that this wouldn't be appropriate. These questionnaires weren't appropriate. I mean, people had distrust of, fronting up with a clipboard and a questionnaire. It wasn't an appropriate thing. So those sort of quantitative research paradigms, and particularly using these sort of strange questions and instruments, just weren't appropriate. And I think that's where I came to research yarning, because it was a much more user-friendly, much more personable way to engage with people, much more friendly. People were familiar with it. And it wasn't that same sort of backlash against the research process, or that, in my experience.
Position people differently, doesn't it? It's there's not someone sort of being worked on. You're just sitting there and you're together, and it's interesting because I think what this sounds like to me is it's really appropriate for qualitative research, but I think you can actually, without opening up another kettle of fish and going on another tangent, but I think you can actually apply the same skill set in quantitative research. It's more of a wrapper of everything else. It doesn't mean you decide to shy away from doing anything with numbers and stats and so on and so forth, and validated measures, etc. It's more that you understand how you understand what the conduit is to doing that well. It's not just about sitting and having a yarn about every single thing that in every research project. There's great application in so many domains of research.
So let's talk about what yarning is. So, John, your understanding of yarning, you're obviously an insider, if you like, which is different to me as a non-Indigenous physio and researcher. What does yarning mean to you, John?
That's a good question, but also it's I think about what an insider is too, and I think it raises a point for me that I think is worth addressing before I go any further. That idea of what an insider is, because my dad's a Wodjila bloke. He's from England. He's from Bristol, and my mum's an Aboriginal woman, and she's from Yamaji country and from down south. So there's a whole range of different tensions that float around there. But then you're a guy who's worked in that space for a long time too, and you have, if not an insider, you have inside knowledge in some way, which I think a lot of people put their hands up and say, no, I can't. But I think it's worth putting that there as well, because that often gets used as a barrier to not doing good research in this way as well. I'll put that there first. Now, what is the yarning? Well, I can probably put it in the context of a practical thing, I suppose. We did, and I spoke about this the other day, we did a research project recently, and we're still kind of involved in it, yarning with family, actually. And so if you think about the conversations that everybody has with their families, whether it's, rousing at each other, whether it's talking about serious things, events, politics, social stuff, climate change, whatever it may be, and these yarns and getting information from one another. I think that really, and I'm straddling this thing of not trying to oversimplify it, because it's actually really nuanced and complex. and sophisticated, but it's also really simple, if that makes sense. This idea of being able to just sit and have a conversation and let it be and let it go where it wants to go.
Yep.
And time constraints will often go out the window, for example. I sat there and had a conversation with my auntie, and my mum was there as well, sitting there. So my mother and I were doing this research project together, and my auntie's there as a participant, but she's family, so she's really kind of the project too. So it blurs the boundaries of what everyone's role is in many ways. And questions would come back to me, and instead of from Art, and instead of me sort of saying, well, no, I'm asking the questions here, I just respond to that, because out of that, so much relevant information comes through that triggers things that are relevant for her. So it's this constant back and forth,
Yep.
information sharing, and there's a lot of laughing, of course, and then there's the dynamic there with the two sisters sitting there, Mum and Art. Mum's rolling her eyes at some of the things that my auntie's saying, kind of thing, because it's about family history.
Yep.
All the things that you would never do if you thought that there was one particular way of getting information about something of relevance.
Collecting data. Yeah.
Ultimately, that's what it is. But I think we've to do it well in this space and to have a yarn, it is really, what is a yarn? It's about letting it be what it needs to be through a very conversational, very connected, relational approach. So I could have said that in about 10 words, but I think you've got to be able to paint a picture of what yarning is in many ways, to get what it is and where the bounds lie and what it maybe isn't. And maybe a question about what isn't yarning is a good one as well.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, so from your perspective, Ivan, what is yarning? Because you've done it as well.
Yeah, well, certainly something that you always reflect on and work on as well. I mean, I guess in contrast to traditional sort of research approaches are often very structured and repeatable and all this sort of stuff. Yarning obviously is conversational based, so it's having that comfort. It's flowing. It follows sort of like a flow, but at the same time you're collecting data. So yeah, I think, obviously mainly for qualitative research, but I think you're right. You could probably apply similar things to more quantitative approaches if you did it in a similar way. So it's much more friendly way of collecting data. It's much more collaborative. So you're having that conversation, you're sharing information. As opposed to the objective researcher collecting the data from the subject. It's much more an engaged approach, and as you've said, John, much more based on relationship and establishing that relationship. To me, much more enjoyable.
It is a really enjoyable process, and I think it's, so we're having this conversation now, kind of thing, and it's it's the collection of ideas and thoughts that bubble up to other things that I think is really important, and that idea of it being really mutual and collaborative resonates so strongly in the idea of yarning, because you're not. It's probably good if you're coming from a perspective where that's your natural way of doing these kind of things, and because you're not filtering yourself, you're not finding, okay, this is where I've got to put a boundary on how much I share, how much I talk about, how much I lead that person's thoughts, so on and so forth. And I think that's worth talking about in terms of what is yarning as well. It allows the conversation to go wherever it needs to go, and it's trusting that the other person as well, whoever they might be, whether it's the researcher or the person taking part in the research as a participant, it's trusting that you can figure out those boundaries together through it, versus there's this arbitrary, not arbitrary, but a structure that's sort of floating around invisibly around you, and not to go beyond those lines. And that's a really co-created kind of set of guidelines and boundaries within each yarn, and that's the beauty of it. Each yarn will actually take on its own life. There'll be a lot of similar things, but each yarn will take on what it needs to take on for that context, created by the two individuals or three or four, however many it is within it. And that's what I love about it, because it's never the same thing either. And it also means, as a researcher, you've got to be really on your feet to catch points that are relevant, and points that might take it somewhere that it really, you never thought it would go, and there's something really rich that comes out of it.
Yeah, but at the same time, there is that skill of, if the yarn goes too off track, it's bringing that yarn back on track, because obviously as researchers you have an agenda. So it's that sort of judging when it's, okay, that's gone too far, and just gently bringing it back and directing that. Let's talk about Dawn's framework. So I'm just going to do, we'll share Dawn's. So the slide that's on the screen now is really the person who's done the seminal work in research yarning, and that's our colleague, Professor Dawn Bessarab from the University of Western Australia. So Dawn first published a seminal paper on research yarning in, just over 10 years ago now. And she talked about the three parts of research yarning, was including the social yarn, the research yarn, and the therapeutic yarn. So we've already talked a bit about the social yarn, John. So that's usually the start. That's usually the beginning of the research yarn, when you're sort of establishing that connectedness and having, it's sort of setting up your relationship in many ways.
Yeah. The terms of engagement. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and
a lot of that might exist already too.
What's that?
A lot of that might actually exist already as well, which is one of the interesting things about, I guess, working with Aboriginal communities. Obviously the connections often lie there. They are already there, and it's
So, and the social yarn, that can be just introducing yourself, talking about anything. It can be talking about anything and everything. It can be about the weather, it can be about sport, it can be about people you know in common, it can be what's been happening recently within the town or city or community, wherever you are. Like, it's about having that sort of connection about something, and often coming down to some sort of shared experience or shared understanding. I'm just looking at the time, so we'll move along to the research yarn. We've already talked about that. So that's gathering data, as it were, but in a friendly, conversational way. And Dawn also talks about the therapeutic yarn. Yeah, what do you understand about that, John?
That's a good question. I'm not sure what I understand about it, to be honest, because I see those three areas as being so deeply connected. But obviously, the social yarn underpins all of it, but I don't think it's not a sequence, and the social yarn weaves all the way through, and I think it's hard to pull apart where a social yarn begins and where a research yarn or ends and a research yarn begins, for example. And so much of it is, for me, is all the same thing, if that makes sense. The whole point of about all of the communication human beings have is to elicit some response from somebody in some particular way, and perhaps part of that idea is just shifting the focus in very subtle ways to a more specific goal, and that again is going back to that idea of what is therapeutic for the individuals within that context. That sounds maybe like I'm trying to not answer the question. It's not so much that, it's that I do find it difficult to I think the principles are applying all the way through. You know, I find it difficult. So we wrote a paper recently that's impressed around essentially research yarning and psychologists, therapists working with Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal practitioners.
Yep.
And sorry, I'm just turning off my email so it doesn't ding in the middle.
I'm just looking at the time here, and I think we're up. Our 20 minutes is up.
Oh, really? Really?
Yeah. So
we can edit some bits out. I'm sure we can. I'll figure that out. But I think the it's more that you're talking about what works, and I think this is where really a collaborative approach is super important. The therapeutic yarn is certainly going to have a greater focus on, well, what works for this person or people who've come for some kind of help in an area of their life.
I think it's also about that reciprocity, isn't it? And accountability, like that. Yeah. Often people bring people want information. People might have a particular issue. It's about sharing that information and responding to that and being able to respond to it, really, isn't it? I mean,
absolutely, that's right.
In the context of musculoskeletal research, invariably the therapeutic yarn's about, well, now you tell me what I can do with my OA or whatever, like it's having that conversation and trying to offer something.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. I mean, it has to be sort of deliberate and having permission to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, so much of that is tied up in the idea of the social yarn, because it's still going to, it's weaving all the way through it, but it's also the thing that underpins whether that person will allow, will allow you to provide help for them.
Yeah.
Because the trust is forged through it. And that's why it's so difficult to tease apart which is which. Because at any given moment, you can also reach that.
Yep.
And the therapeutic yarn all of a sudden stops being overly therapeutic because that person is no longer looking at you as someone they can put their trust in. So it's an ongoing tension and balancing act.
Agree. I reckon we should wind up this yarn now, though, because otherwise we'll just keep yarning and we'll. So yeah, look, thanks for the yarn, John.
That's fine. I appreciate it. And like I said, it was always going to go long.
Yeah, and if hopefully John and I will be talking, doing a workshop on clinical yarning, which will be probably a little bit more structured if people are interested in how you might apply yarning to clinical practice. So that's on Sunday session. So thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. Cheers, Ivan.